On April 14th, 2019, at 9 p.m. U.S. time, HBO premiered the 8th and final season of Game of Thrones. At that exact moment, nearly 17 million viewers gathered in front of their various screens, phones, TVs, or computers, setting a record for the highest viewership of any drama ever. 17 million people were on the edge of their seats for that first episode, not to mention the following ones we eagerly awaited leaks for, with a passion that rivaled waiting for exam results. Game of Thrones is arguably the most successful drama in television production history. It racked up over 655 award nominations, including 159 Emmy nominations, and took home a total of 398 awards, 59 of which were Emmys. That Emmy count alone is a massive achievement. Game of Thrones wasn't just another show, it completely shattered the traditional drama rule that viewership dwindles as seasons increase. Take Breaking Bad, for example. After the bank robbery, the characters seemed to have an identity crisis and didn't know what to do. But with Game of Thrones, the number of viewers actually increased year after year. The first season averaged about 9.3 million viewers in America, while that number jumped to 33 million by the 7th season. Some might attribute this success to the spectacular production and the mind-blowing audio and visual effects that brought giant, fire-breathing dragons to life. And yes, production is a huge factor, but the core of its success lies in the story, the drama, and the intricate plot lines. A story crafted by the brilliant writer George R.R. Martin, author of the famous A Song of Ice and Fire novel series, from which this epic show was inspired. Is Game of Thrones rooted in reality? What if I told you that this series, with all its bloody events and complex dramatic twists, is based on a solid foundation of real history? Maybe I've got your attention now. To clarify, Game of Thrones takes place on two fictional continents, Westeros and Essos. However, the show draws heavily from history. In fact, let me surprise you by saying that some events in it are directly influenced by real historical events. Martin was fascinated by medieval history, a period teeming with events that could dwarf the imagination of the greatest authors. Is this great work of art just plagiarism? The truth is, everyone draws inspiration from history. From the Middle Ages, we can find the core plot of our show, the plot of Game of Thrones, starting with a central question: who has the legitimate claim to the throne after years of a seemingly stable but ultimately fragile reign? That's King Robert Baratheon. As soon as he dies, the war we followed throughout the series erupts. This is known in dramatic terms as the catalyst, the inciting incident that propels the story forward. If we look at 14th and 15th century English history, we find an event strikingly similar to this plot, the series of wars known as the Wars of the Roses. The fundamental question there was, who had the rightful claim to the English throne? Was it the House of York, whose emblem was the white rose, or the House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose? Interestingly, the Lannisters in the show parallel the real Lancasters in history. The struggle for the throne began 80 years before the war, when King Edward III died in 1377. This man ruled England for a full 50 years, and during his reign he managed to transform it into a powerful nation from a collection of fragmented kingdoms. Since he had an heir, his eldest son, things were supposed to proceed smoothly, but history held surprises. Due to the twists of fate, the heir died a year before his father. At that point, contrary to tradition, Edward III, in shock from his son's death, decided to extend the line of succession to his grandson, his deceased son's son, named Richard II. The problem here was that the deceased heir had two other brothers. The king effectively ignored two of his direct sons, who would later be the ancestors of the two families I mentioned, York and Lancaster. A few months later, Edward III died, and his grandson, Richard II, ascended to the throne. So we had two brothers who were overlooked in the succession, and they discovered that their father had essentially sold the throne to their nephew. The descendants of these two brothers never forgot their claim, and would wait a full 20 years until 1399. That's when the leader of the Lancasters, Henry IV, successfully overthrew Richard II, the grandson, from the throne and took his place. After him came his son, Henry V. Despite the many conflicts of that era, it was a relatively stable period. In the show, King Robert Baratheon suffers a fatal injury from a wild boar during a hunting trip. His wound becomes infected, and he dies. This is exactly what happened to Henry V, who suddenly sustained an inexplicable injury during a military campaign and suffered severe pain until he died in his tent. If you remember correctly, Cersei Lannister in the show is a powerful and intelligent woman. Her historical counterpart is Queen Margaret. Henry V died, succeeded by his son, Henry VI, who was weak-willed and suffered from a mental illness, likely schizophrenia. Henry VI married one of Europe's most beautiful princesses, and at the same time, one of the world's fiercest and most intelligent women, the French princess who became Queen of England after their marriage, Margaret. Of course, you don't have to think too hard to realize her counterpart in the show is Cersei Lannister. Yes, she's the woman who married anyone she wanted to kill and told the one she loved, "Thanks, bro." She was a powerful character just like Cersei, and just just like Cersei, the English people hated her. They saw her as just a French woman who came to rule them, and frankly, the feeling was mutual. She hated them too. Margaret's main enemy would be a member of the York family, the Lancasters' rivals. This person was summoned from the north to be the king's advisor and protector. His name was Richard of York, or in other words, the late Ned Stark. Richard would try to eliminate the widespread misery and poverty in England at that time. This poverty was caused by the king's self-absorption and his mental episodes, which allowed Richard's influence to grow more and more. Margaret hated him, and finally, she managed to get a signed decree from the king during one of his mental episodes to banish Richard to the north. But let me tell you, Richard would be a strong character, yes, just like Ned Stark. Richard was quickly defeated by the Lancasters, captured, and beheaded. Exactly what happened to Ned Stark in that scene we still can't get over. 7 seasons we waited for him to come back. After Richard's execution, his severed head was hung above Micklegate Bar, with a paper crown placed on it, a form of mockery. Isn't this the man who claimed to rule? This is his end. We'll hang his head and put paper on it. And just like the end of the first season with the death of Ned Stark, or Richard of York, the world has been in turmoil ever since and hasn't settled. The fate of Robb Stark. If you remember the character of Robb Stark, Ned Stark's son, whom we all loved and dreaded going to weddings with, Robb who led a march from the north to take the north. His real-life counterpart is King Edward IV, the son of the northern Richard whose head was cut off, Ned Stark. This son's goal was to kill Margaret and her bastard son, illegitimate. Yes, Margaret had a son whose paternity to the king was questioned, and he was believed to be the result of an illicit affair. This son, Margaret's son, who is Cersei, is Edward of Westminster. If you see his picture, you'll find him a handsome young man with angelic features, but please don't be fooled by his looks, because what you expect is true. According to historians, Margaret raised this son with violence and arrogance. From a young age, she instilled in him vileness, meanness, and a thirst for revenge, to the point that they would bring him, a small child at 8 years old, to preside over people's beheadings. A child at that age learns to pray, while this one was executing people. From the north, we see Robb Stark, or in this case, Edward IV, leading a march of revenge for his father against the Lancasters and Margaret specifically. And so, the Lancasters meet the Yorkists in the Battle of Tewkesbury, a battle that ends in the worst possible outcome for Margaret. When the Lancaster forces are defeated, and Edward's, or Joffrey's in the show, head is immediately cut off despite all his pleas. He dies at 20 years old. Despite the death of Margaret's pampered and violent son, Margaret's own escape, and the successful revenge of Edward IV, who is Robb Stark in the show's case, who knew how to avenge his father, the story doesn't end there. The throne isn't just fought over by 2 as you've seen. Many contend for it. On the other side of England, after crossing the English Channel, you find a prince in France being raised in exile, destined to return and claim the throne. Perhaps Henry Tudor. Imagine, who does this parallel in the show? Is it Jon Snow or Khal Drogo? Both answers are wrong, but you're close. Prince Henry Tudor in the show is equivalent to Daenerys Targaryen. The man in history was a prince in France, and the drama added some embellishments, making him a woman who couldn't be burned by fire, the mother of 3 dragons. Henry was from a branch of the Lancaster family that fled after Margaret's, who is Cersei, defeat. Now the Yorkists were in power, and because the Yorkists weren't weak, they tried to cut him off early, which is why they tried to kill him multiple times in exile, but they failed. Henry, the exiled prince in France, who is Daenerys, believed he was the rightful heir to the throne since childhood, and even though he didn't have an army, forces, or dragons like Daenerys, or even her beauty, he was confident. Did he go to Khal Drogo in his tent himself? The truth is, he had something else. Henry was very confident, and when he felt in 1484 that the circumstances were right and ripe, he prepared ships just like Daenerys, sailed across the English Channel, and reached the British Isles. There he went to the people of Wales and asked them to help him reclaim his throne. The idea was that the Welsh hated the Yorkists, so when an exiled prince from the Lancasters came to them and said, "We will remove this Yorkist rule and we will return," they believed him. "We will answer the call," and they went. This gave him an army of 6,000 Welsh soldiers to begin his march to London to reclaim his throne. After a series of small battles, the Lancasters led by Henry would meet the ruling Yorkists in the Battle of Bosworth Field. Here, Henry Tudor, the exiled prince, triumphs and reclaims his throne. In a brilliant move, he announces his marriage to a princess from the York family he had just defeated in battle. This princess, who in the show is roughly equivalent to Jon Snow. Yes, he made Henry Daenerys a woman, and the Yorkist princess Jon Snow a man. These contradictions are what will stick with you. Didn't you notice he loved his aunt? The important thing is that Henry ends the lineage of both the Lancaster and York families, telling them, "We are all cousins from Edward III. There was no Lancaster or York. We were, my brethren, one family once upon a time." And so ends a 30-year war in England, or what is historically known as the Wars of the Roses. This wasn't just any war, it was a war that changed English history forever. Because just as in Game of Thrones, most of England's princes and nobles died in these battles, which left many castles under the authority of nobles without rulers, and also contributed to the end of of feudalism in England because there were no more feudal lords. This war inspired many English writers long before George R.R. Martin. We find it, for example, in Shakespeare's works, such as the Henry VI trilogy and the play Richard III. In fact, let me tell you that the name Wars of the Roses that I keep repeating to you was Shakespeare's own invention. And finally, my friend, this is where our episode ends for today, to keep it within the episode's time. Wait for me in part 2. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment about important or mysterious historical files you'd like us to discuss. See you later. Take care.